Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Smith. I'm the chairman of the New Zealand Fabian Society, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this presentation tonight by Professor Guy Standing on Rentier Capitalism and the Coming Precariat Revolt, I think. Just a bit about this New Zealand Fabian Society was reincarnated in 2009. The first Fabian Society in New Zealand was started here in Christchurch in the late 19th century. It was its objectives were socialists dedicated to the control of the means of production, and were visited, in fact, by the founder of the British Fabian Society, Beatrice Webb, who came to Christchurch and commented on the quality of the water in the aquifer, and also said that of all the countries in the world, of course, in those days, New Zealand was a leader in social policy transformation. Of all the countries in the world where she might want to bring up her children, New Zealand would come second after Britain. And although some of us might want to disagree on that, and the Christchurch was a very pleasant town compared to some of the English country towns. So the Fabians have a long history going back in Christchurch. Pemba Reeves, who lived in Christchurch and was an MP down here, I think, and was the architect of the Industrial Conciliation and Arbitration Act, was a Fabian here and back in England. We are aiming we present regular series of presentations in Auckland and Wellington, and are hoping to continue to do so in Christchurch in conjunction with the WEA. And so we are aiming to bring the sort of speakers that we have tonight in Guy Standing, who has given several presentations for us over the last couple of years, and they are, I'm sure you will find tonight, outstanding in their breadth and depth. Guy's notion of the precariat gives a name to those people of whom there are millions, and probably millions in New Zealand, whose income is precarious in a variety of ways. Tonight he's going to talk more also about the Rentier Capitalism, because it's the form of finance capital. We no longer live in a world of industrial capital, we live in a world of finance capital. And it's the way finance capital is organised that in fact drives the precarious living of so many people in this country and elsewhere. So that's enough from me for introduction. Please welcome Guy Standing to Christchurch. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you all for coming out this evening. There's always an opportunity cost of time, so I appreciate your coming to listen. If I were a politician in New Zealand, or if I were a Labour leader or an activist, I would be tempted to carry around this piece of paper to every meeting that I go to. It's a very simple piece of paper, and you can't see it from here, so you can see it afterwards. But what is on it is a graph. It's a graph tracing the development of incomes and distribution of incomes in New Zealand since 1980 up to 2015. All right? And it's very similar to a graph that you will get in the United States or Britain or many other countries today. What it shows is that not only has the inequality grown in that period in New Zealand, but the bottom three deciles have effectively had no change. The bottom 2 deciles, their income since 1980 to 2014 have fallen. Okay? And then you look up in the graph, and of course, the further up you go, the deciles, the further the increase in growth. So the top decile in that period, their average income increased by over 65%. Right? Now, there is a story over 35 years that is being replicated in country after country. And you don't have to be a raving leftist like me to think that this is socially and economically unsustainable. Right? The ugliness of it and the smugness and hubristic attitudes by those people in that upper group is a shame on all of us. Okay? And that is a context, and it's quite an interesting piece of paper. And I would be showing it to everybody who was doubting some of the things I'm going to talk about. Now, there's nobody more boring than an author who's just finished a book. Because he thinks it's important, and he's going to let everybody else know that he thinks it's important. And for him or her, it is important. And the book I called Rentier Capitalism, The Coming Revolt. But between the time when Mike and I agreed on the title for the discussion, my publisher said, look, that has no sex appeal. I want you to be able to sell your book in airports and all over the place. And Rentier Capitalism, nobody will really understand. Not even economists. And he came up with a title which he said, how about the corruption of capitalism? So I said under my breath, capitalism is always corrupt. I also said that I didn't like it, I didn't want it. But he was adamant, and I tried to say, okay. And in the end, I have kept to his title because I reinterpreted what he meant. He was wanting me to talk about corrupt individuals making money on that stuff. And it's not interesting to me. If you want that, that's fine. We get it in newspapers every day. But it's about the corruption of the claimed ideals that they proclaim. They proclaim a belief in a free market system. Right? And yet, what I'm going to be talking about and what the book is about is that this actually is the most unfree market system ever created. And it's a system that is a lie, or a series of lies. And it's important for us because in the next period where we're going through a politically very febrile and very difficult period, we have a responsibility to make it clear what is actually happening, not what they claim is happening, right? Now, before I come to the narrative of this evening's talk, let me just say a brief few words about the notion of the precariat. I've been writing about the precariat for many years, but it was only when I wrote a book which I wanted to get out there and reach people who are not economists about the precariat, and I called it the precariat, the new dangerous class. And essentially what has been happening is a new globalized class structure has been created across the world with a plutocracy, an elite, a shrinking salariat, people with pensions and nice benefits and all those things. And the old proletariat is dwindling everywhere, and you've got this precariat growing underneath. Global capitalism wants a precariat. It's not an underclass. Underclass are out there in the streets dying, holding out their hands or a hat for something from us. The precariat is the millions that Mike has just mentioned of people who are being habituated to internalize and accept a life of unstable labour and unstable living. But it's not just that they're in casualised jobs and things like that. That, to me, is low-hanging fruit of the definition. More importantly is that people in the precariat have no occupational identity or narrative that they can give to their lives. I am becoming something. I am something. They can't do that. They're flitting bits and pieces lives, precarious living. And in that, they're having to do a hell of a lot of work for labour that doesn't get remunerated, recognised statistically or rhetorically by politicians, but they have to do it. Networking, retraining, applying for jobs, applying for more jobs, doing interviews, queuing, filling in forms. I've received thousands of emails from people in the precariat from across the world, including from New Zealanders, telling me their story. And they're having to live in this precarious way. And it's humiliating. It's not just frustrating and stressful, but it's humiliating. And another part of the definition is that this is the first working class ever created with a level of education, on average, higher than the level of labour that they are expected to do. That's unique, you know. And they also have to rely almost entirely on money wages. Money wages which are falling in real value, becoming more volatile and uncertain, and leaving them always on the edge of unsustainable debt. And in the process, they are becoming, as the subtitle of the Precariat Charter, the second book, I use the term denizens. Now, my books have been translated into many languages, and always the translator, whatever the language, comes to me at some stage and says, "What does denizen mean?" And I have to say that it's actually an old medieval English term, which referred to people who, when they went into a town in the Middle Ages in Britain, were given a more limited range of rights than the burghers of the town. Okay? More limited in terms of duration and more limited in scope. But this is the first time in history when millions of citizens are losing the 5 types of rights. They're losing cultural rights. They can't belong to a community that gives them a sense of ethics and standards and reciprocities. They're losing civil rights because they don't have access to a universal justice system. They're losing political rights because in the spectrum out there they don't see parties and politicians representing their aspirations and needs. They're losing social rights because governments are turning to means testing and behaviour testing and more behaviour testing and more sanctions and more petty bureaucratic intrusions designed to take away benefits. That's happening everywhere. And they're losing economic rights because they cannot practice what they're qualified to do. It's a bad hand to have, right? So that is the precariat. They're anxious, they're alienated, they're anomic, and they're angry. Okay? So I put that aside for the moment. We'll come back to it in the course of the talk. And now I want to turn to the narrative of this evening. 80 years ago, John Maynard Keynes, in his general theory, predicted the euthanasia of the rentier. Because, he said, capital will become so plentiful there will not be a shortage of making excess income through rental practices. And he predicted that rental income would disappear, and he welcomed that prospect very strongly. But actually what's happened since the beginning of the 1980s is through the combination of globalization, neoliberalism, and the technological revolution that's taking place, which I'm not going to discuss this evening, we have had the emergence not only of an unfree market system, but a system of strengthening rental income in many ways. And rental income stems, first and foremost, by disrupting the economic system that we took for granted when I was a student. As you all know, neoliberalism has meant the privatization of everything that can be privatized, the commodification of everything that can be commodified, and the pursuit of competitiveness. National competitiveness, personal, corporate. You can't be competitive enough. Endless pressure to be more competitive. And in the process, a systematic dismantling of all institutions and mechanisms of social solidarity. Why? They stand against the market. They give you your values and protections against market forces. So they must go. That's their mentality. Not mine, that's theirs. They're welcome to it. But that's what's been happening. And in the labour market, on which I'm fundamentally focused, some strange things have been happening. And I put it in terms of 5 snakes. You know how a snake opens its jaws? Its jaws open, the one goes up, the other one like that, right? Well, we have 5 snakes whose jaws have been opening. It's very strange. When I was a student of economics at Cambridge, we were taught standard things. When productivity went up, wages went up. Fair enough. But in the last 30 years, in country after country, when productivity goes up, wages go down. Bizarre, right? In other words, the workers are not gaining anything from productivity improvements. The second snake, it used to be when employment rose, wages rose. Fair enough, isn't it? That was sort of basic. Not anymore. In country after country, when employment goes up, wages have been going down, on average. Right? And that's because many of the new jobs are paying very low wages. So it lowers the average. Third, which I think is a very interesting one, because, as I mentioned last night, and Mike smiled at this one, I remember, is that George Osborne, you've heard of him, class warrior number 1 as far as I'm concerned at the moment, as you can imagine. He found that when employment started rising under his stewardship as Chancellor, tax revenue from employment went down. That's not meant to happen. Well, the reason was that many of the new jobs weren't even paying adequately to get above the tax-paying threshold, right? So tax revenue was going down. Not meant to happen like that. The fourth snake, very much related to the others, is that when profits and rental income rise, it used to be the case that wages rose. Not anymore. And the final snake is a very strange one we're seeing in many European countries. It used to be the case if the real wages fell, then unit labour costs fell. But here we are finding in country after country that despite stagnant real wages, unit labour costs have been going up for various reasons that I'm not going into. And the reason this whole package is out there is that the labour market is no longer able to deliver adequate incomes to workers. We're in the middle of the great convergence, where in a globalized system, the wages in places like China and Indonesia and Vietnam have many, many years of slow rise to reach anything that a New Zealander or a British worker would have accepted as the norm a few years ago. And as long as that is the case, there will be continuing downward pressure on our wages. And it would be a fool who thought that the approach to changing the inequalities I mentioned at the beginning would be through wage bargaining. I hope we get some success. Don't misinterpret what I'm saying. But we will not get a real change through wage bargaining. Okay, we get marginal improvements, we can stop the rot to a certain extent, we can reduce the differentials by various means, but we will not get a big rise in real wages. Now, what's going on? Well, the first thing is that since the 1990s in particular, a new institutionalized architecture has been constructed to operate the global market system. I happen to live near Geneva, and when I went there, the main organizations were the United Nations, the ILO where I was working, and to a certain extent UNCTAD. Then after a few years, the new kid on the block was the World Trade Organization, which was the midwife of globalization. So their officials would strut around, they were creating the global system, okay? And there was a little funny old organization down in back street, run by a crook, who was a bit of an idiot. His main claim to fame was he had something like the Order of the Pink Elephant from some African tyrant. Today, if you go to Geneva, that organization has gone from obscurity and ridicule to becoming the heart of the Geneva architecture, with a great new conference centre jutting out into the centre, and it's WIPO. The very name WIPO used to be thought of as a detergent or something like that, you know. We have endless jokes about WIPO. What do you do with WIPO? Don't go there, don't go there. But actually it stands for the World Intellectual Property Organization. And since TRIPS was passed and the GATS came into force in 1995, what has happened is that an international intellectual property regime has been constructed. So since 1995, the annual number of patents filed with WIPO per year has tripled. There are something like 10 million patents in operation across the world now, and a huge backlog of unprocessed patent applications. What is a patent? A patent is if you register some invention or some new business practice, it effectively gives you a guaranteed monopoly income for 20 years. All right? So if you register something and you invent this, and you put it and you register it, nobody can produce that except you unless you sell it to them. So patents have become a globalized phenomenon. They restrict market forces, of course they do. And Thomas Jefferson made this wonderful statement when he said patents, he hated patents. And he said inventions cannot in nature be a subject of property. To do so is more embarrassment than advantage to society. Hear, hear. But yet, across the world, patents have been monopolized by plutocratic corporations and plutocratic individuals to earn billions and billions of dollars. So the big corporations that are winners out of this process can buy up patents from a little man or woman for a couple of million. You'll be happy for it. Yeah, okay, I invented this in my garage. And they put it all together and they can hoover them up. That's the term that's used. Hoover up patents and turn the process into billions and billions of dollars that go on for years to come. Is this a free market? Not in my definition of economics or free markets. In addition to patents, we have copyright. So many things that used to be out there, ideas that shared, Mike came up with a couplet the other day. If he registered it as copyrighted, nobody could say it without his permission. I mean, it's mad. But millions of copyrights out there are guaranteeing monopoly income to the person who has the copyright, or the publishing company often, for years and years and years and years. Wait for it. Under the law now, international law, copyrights guarantee you a monopoly income for 50 years after your death. I don't know what you're going to do with the money, but good luck. Is that a free market? Okay. The same with brands and industrial designs, which are another form of intellectual property that companies and individuals are registering. They're multiplying. Each and every one potentially gives the owner a monopoly income. You can't use them. So all those names, those brands that are dominated, there are so many names that you can't use. And there are now a legal industry chasing up people who might use something that is already registered. So you better be careful with what you do. You think you come up with a new idea, but you'll find that somewhere someone has registered it. Is this a free market? No, if you can employ fancy lawyers and you can employ fancy people with fancy names, you've got it made. But that is the reality we're facing today. Now, besides the patents and copyrights and all of these things, what's been happening very interestingly is that the geography of intellectual property is changing. The United States, which has been turning itself into a rentier economy by this mechanism, have used intellectual property as a way of controlling the system. The Federal Reserve chairman a few years ago made the remark, I think he probably regretted it, that the United States was not producing anything, it was producing intellectual property, because it makes money from that way. But the geography is changing because since 2013, the biggest filer of all these things is no longer the United States, but China. And if I give you one example, Foxconn, which produces many of the iPhones and various electronic gadgets that we have in this room, has over 1 million employees. It also has 12,000 patents. One company. And it's got a lot of things locked up for years ahead. So the geography is changing quite quickly. But there's another aspect. Many of you are engaged in fighting the TPP, quite rightly, but possibly for the wrong reasons. You don't want to fight it for protectionist reasons. You want to fight it because it is fundamentally protecting this intellectual property regime. That's the real reason. Let's put them on the defensive by saying, yeah, we believe in free markets more than you do. Okay? But you're talking about tackling something, and just as we in Europe are talking about the transatlantic trade and investment partnership, which is the similar thing, being orchestrated by US capital, by US corporations. They're taking all the lead. They're providing the lawyers. They're advising the US administration and their negotiators with these treaties. You don't think this is altruistic free trade stuff? It isn't. And you don't have to be a real radical leftist to see what's going on. But it's a bit like closing the door after the horse has bolted. Because there are now over 3,200 trade and investment agreements in operation across the world. Mostly orchestrated at bilateral level, but some by regional level and some more global in character. Each and every one of those is locking in corporate rights, inverted commas. And they have an instrument which, as I said last night in Wellington, and I apologize for those who were there for my repeating it, is the most undemocratic institution you could imagine. It's called the Investor-State Dispute Settlement, ISDS. I see some nodding recognition. It is a disgrace, a real disgrace. And what it is basically any corporation in any country, be, for example, New Zealand. Here we give an example. If a government changes a policy which the corporation believes will affect their profits, perhaps, then they can take the government to this process. It consists of 3 lawyers, all from the corporate world, you know. It has to be on a panel. One of those 3, they act as judges in effect. One of them is appointed by the multinational, one by the government, and one, if they can't agree on the 3rd one, is appointed in many cases, most cases, by the president of the World Bank. That independent organization that is altruistic and blah, blah, blah. Right? Well, funnily enough, the World Bank always must have, under their rules, a US citizen as its president. That is part of the rules. So surprise, surprise, the US government has never lost a case before the ISDS. I wonder why that is. But it's not really very funny, because countries that are losing are often low-income, small countries that are subsequently forced to compensate these corporations to the tune of hundreds of millions of US dollars. Is this a free market? Not in my book. It's a rigged, corrupted system. So one government that I'm thinking of introduced pollution control in a river because the fish were dying because this corporation was poisoning the water. So the corporation turned around and said, hey, you're affecting our profits. We can't use the river. So they sued the government. And the government had to cave in. So guess what's happening to all those fish in that river and the swimming capacities for the children in that river? Gone. So we have this process, the architecture and the institutions and the agreements are locking in something. In addition, what's been happening is, in the pursuit of competitiveness, neoliberal governments, including your esteemed government of your esteemed Prime Minister, are using subsidies to increase their competitiveness. Subsidies that include selective tax systems, where you have a regressive system because not all sources of income are taxed at the same rate. So increasingly, labour, the performance of labour, is taxed at a much higher rate than capital. Okay? But you also have so many tax breaks and selective tax rates. And of course, governments, including the British government and the Irish government, most egregiously, are bidding down corporation tax rate lower and lower and lower. And making it, I just arrived in this country when I said, am I still in Britain? Because I'm reading the same story here as I was when I went through Britain recently. It turns out that multinationals are enabled to avoid tax altogether. The top biggest, 6 biggest multinational British corporations, who made £30 billion worth of profit last year, £30 billion, guess they didn't pay a single penny in corporation tax. What system is this? Right? Now, besides the facilitated tax avoidance and the tax evasion that takes place and the tax havens that have been allowed and so on, and the subsidies given out, I was checking on the national accounts. You have quite a few subsidies left in New Zealand. You've done very well in the sense of removing them from agriculture, but there are other subsidies that come to a considerable amount. And every single one of them in some way is regressive because they undercut capital, they give benefits to middle or upper income groups. And in that connection, I want to mention tax credits. I talked about tax credits last night, and one gentleman who was, I think, a plant from some far-right group jumped up very vehemently in the question and answer afterwards. And Mike and I had to sort of lower his blood pressure because he was trying to attack my points on tax credits. But tax credits are effectively a subsidy to capital. Because what they do is they allow firms to employ people at very low wages, knowing that they're going to be topped up by tax credits. And they're equivalent to the Spinamum system at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. Yes, they do raise people out of poverty to a certain extent, but only at the price of enabling firms to pay low wages and locking people into low-wage jobs and reducing the bargaining power of people. If I know and I'm being paid a very low wage, and I know it's going to be topped up by a tax credit, then why should I bother if the employer is screwing me? Excuse me. There's that sort of mentality. Now, the funny thing about tax credits, which you have in this country and every other country that I know, every other Anglo-Saxon country, is that they create tremendous poverty traps. A poverty trap is when if you go from a low benefit or low tax credit or whatever it is to a low wage job, you get taxed in effect at a marginal tax rate. In New Zealand it's over 70%, in Britain it's 80%. If it makes you feel any better, the German situation it's 86%. What that means for those who are non-economists is that there is no incentive to take low wage jobs. Right? Now imagine if the middle class, Mr. Key, for example, he's upper class, we know, finance, blah, blah, blah. But imagine him paying a 70% marginal tax rate. I wonder what would happen next. Right? But that's what people in the precariat have to face. Now, this is a subsidy that is very costly. It costs over $4 billion a year in New Zealand, which is a lot of money that is being used, and it doesn't really help with the labour market. It doesn't give people security. It's costly to administer. And as a newspaper story I read this morning shows, and no surprise, many people who should be benefiting don't benefit, and it can be cynically manipulated by government bureaucrats. We know that. Okay. Then in addition, you have the bank bailouts, and what we've experienced in Britain, in Europe, in the United States, in Japan, quantitative easing. Now, quantitative easing is a new-fangled term. Basically, it's a matter of shoving hundreds of millions of dollars or pounds or euros or whatever other currency is used into the banking community to enable them to invest where they choose. Really, it should be called a basic income for bankers. And basically, it doesn't really work, because the idea is it's meant to stimulate growth, cause a devaluation of the currency to make your exports more competitive, and boost demand. Well, surprise, surprise, with all the experiments that have now been done with quantitative easing, giving vast amount of money to bankers and hedge funds and all these financiers, is that the evidence is coming in which was obviously going to happen. Growth has not increased. Much of the money goes into the Chinese property market or some other property market or into stock exchanges where they can get the highest rate of return. There hasn't been an inflationary growth, but there has been an increase in inequality as a result of QE. Now, nobody should be surprised. And yet these so-called independent bankers can get away with doing their brothers and sisters in their financial communities this lovely service of giving out largesse. Is this a free market? No, it's not. It's part of the rentier system. Next, we have a situation where debt. You know about that? Debt. We're all suffering from debt. Debt used to be something that, happened to the unfortunate, and sometimes you could borrow for a house, and if you're lucky enough, etc. Now, debt has become a systematic source of exploitation. It's a systematic thing. And the irony was, in 2008, when the crash came, there was a paper, a technical paper done by two American neoclassical economists, saying that if a country has more than 90% debt, 90% of GDP of debt, it will slow growth. And this was used by governments, right-wing governments, to say, see, we've got to reduce our debt. So we're going in for austerity, and this justifies cutting public spending, cutting public services, cutting public this and that, and benefits for the disabled or whatever group they can get away with. 3 years later, some people who are actually friends of mine, so I should be careful, they produced a paper showing that the original paper claiming this was statistically flawed, bad data, wrong. And the authors had to confess they'd made mistakes. Meanwhile, millions of people had suffered as a result of austerity and the logic of this argument. Subsequently, while governments on the right are cutting public spending in order to cut public debt, the evidence has accumulated, and even the IMF has found this. It's not public debt that matters. It's private debt. It's private debt. And if you cut public spending, guess what happens to private debt? It goes up. A lot more people are plunged into debt, particularly in the precariat, and more people are plunged into the precariat. So you have in this country what you'll be glad to know is also happening in other countries, so it makes you feel better. Your private household debt is equal to 160% of disposable income. That's very high by international standards and is usually associated with something bad coming up. Don't be too complacent. I know you're not, but you know what I mean. Now you have a situation where debt is growing through student loans, student accommodation. Millions of young people are emerging from university with an albatross around their neck that's going to last for most of their lives in many cases, because they can't earn big money, right? And you're getting various forms of peculiar practices. The British government has struck on a wheeze, which the Americans have been doing for several years, bundling debt from people, say students or householders, bundling the debt and selling to private equity companies as an asset. So they can use the bundle of debt to borrow and make more money from a bundle of debt. Securitization is the fancy word that's given it. Is this a free market? They're using people in distress to make vast profits. That's rentier profits. They're not producing anything. They're not providing a service or producing a good that is of value to any of you in this room. But they're making nice money. That's what's happening at the lower end of what this financial system is producing. Now, the next part of the story is what's happening to the commons. The commons is something that was neglected by the left for too long. The commons has always been the most valuable part of society. It goes back to the Charter of the Forest of 1217. I'm planning to try and launch a campaign because it's the 800th anniversary of the Charter of the Forests next year. So we should plan a progressive campaign around it. Because the Charter of the Forests was the first charter and set of demands made against the state for the right of subsistence, the right to common, the right of widows to have estivas, the common produce, the right of the public land to remain the public land, the public waterways to remain the public. And over the centuries, the principles of the Charter of the Forests have been extended to the social commons, the parks, the amenities, the libraries, the museums that have been built up over many generations, that are part of us. They don't belong to any private commercial interest to make profits. But that is what's happening. Governments are quietly, by stealth, selling off or commercializing the commons for their special interests who just happen, I know it's pure coincidence, they just happen to be their friends, corporate or otherwise. We are seeing that in ugly ways. Before I came here, I was trying to read the chapter I've written that is now with the publisher. I can't do anything about it. And it's the sort of chapter that I think I should read in a bath, because it will keep the bath water hot. You know, I still get angry at my own text, but it's too late to tone it down. But the revival of the commons is going to be a central challenge for all of us, because we're seeing it chipped away, eroded, turned into sources of profit. When you see a great park being dwindled, the Lake District being sold off piecemeal, land, commons, libraries closed, we should all be furious, right? But it's part of rentier capitalism because it's giving rental income through the back door. The next part of the story, which I'll be very brief about, but it's a long chapter and it's also about the precariat, is that we are on the cusp of a revolution in the way labour and work is organised. Within the next decade, 1 in every 3 labour transactions, everywhere, will be done online. We won't be having fixed employment on fixed workplaces, which means that our labour law and collective bargaining systems and welfare systems are going to be made redundant, because more and more people are working through the cloud or working through Uber or Airbnb, doing little things, neither employees nor self-employed, because these app platform corporations that are emerging are essentially labour brokers. They are rentiers. So, for example, Uber, which today has over 1 million, beg your pardon, let's get it right, 1 million drivers on contract. It's operating in 90 odd countries. It has a huge number of people. It's driving down taxi rates of their competitors deliberately through predatory pricing. But every single time you get into an Uber taxi or any of their competitors, you're paying 20% of that price directly to Uber. It's the case with all of these app platforms. TaskRabbit actually charges 30%. So the requester through TaskRabbit takes 30% of what's spent. This is sweating. This is really a new form of sweating. But you have the concierge economy with all these services, which includes, I love the one that's in London now. You can ring up an app and someone will come around and walk your dog for a price. You understand? I mean, you know. So the activity that was a piece of leisure is turned into a commodified labour activity, and somebody's making money out of your dog walking, besides the poor person who's taking the dog, you know, who's doing it out of desperation. But there are numerous things that are taking this shape, right? It's not just an incidental thing. There are millions of people involved in all of these things. But also, and the most disgusting, I think, is cloud labour, where people, there are corporations, are acting as requesters, and they put up tasks to be competed for or done online, and people are effectively trying to get the contract to do these tasks, which are called HITs, human intelligent transactions or whatever, and they're paid very low because someone in Christchurch may be competing with someone in Accra or Bangalore or wherever. So already the rates are being driven down to extremely low levels. But if you're in desperate circumstances, you probably do it. Huh? You've got a small child or whatever it might be. So you have this transformation of the labour process, creating a rentier system and growing insecurity and plunging more and more people into the precariat. Now, this can't go on. And we're going to see, and we are seeing, a revolt. It's taking various forms. Because since I've written the books on the precariat, I've been invited to speak about the precariat in over 350 places, in 35 countries. I've had to turn down a lot of invitations. There's something in the water because it's happening everywhere. In Japan, in Korea, in South Africa, you name it. And people are getting very angry. But the protest that's emerging, and the great events of the Occupy movement and the Indignado movement of 2011, is changing the political atmosphere in very interesting but unpredictable ways. What we're seeing is that the first faction of the precariat consists of the relatively uneducated, the offspring of people who fell out of working class communities and families. They don't have a lot of education, but they feel frustrated because they cannot have what their parents had, and some status. This group is easily lured by the sirens of neo-fascist populism onto the rocks. Mr. Donald Trump is their current champion. But he has some esteemed colleagues in Europe and elsewhere. Next year you will see Marine Le Pen in France playing more cleverly, I think, than Trump is to get their vote. She came very close last year, and she's playing very cleverly. There are leaders of this far-right populists in government in many countries already. And they're playing it hard and playing to win. And we in Europe are experiencing the refugee crisis, which is the biggest humanitarian crisis since the Second World War. And it's fanning this part of the protest. Unless the insecurities of this group is addressed, they will continue to march towards the sounds of a Trump. not a trumpet. But there is another part of the Precariat that is also protesting. This is the educated part that went to university and college, and they were promised by their parents and their teachers a future, a career, a dignity, a dignified work for their life. And they come out knowing that they were sold a lottery ticket. And the lottery ticket is worth less and less and cost more and more to obtain. They're saddled with debt. Now this group is frustrated because it doesn't have a future. But it won't go to the Trumps and the Marine Le Pens and things. They won't do that. They're looking for what I call in the books a politics of paradise, a new progressive politics. And they look around to Labour parties and Social Democratic parties and Socialist parties, and they don't find it. They don't find it. Now, 3 reactions have been taking place. The first reaction, which we all know about, is to detach themselves from party politics altogether and abstain from elections and say, flip off the lot of you, you're all the same. That sort of reaction. When I talk to people and they express that view, I said, that is only surrendering to the bastards. You can't do that. But it's very difficult because they are right to be angry and cynical. They are right. The second part of the reaction, and I think Mike gives more hope to this than I do, but I hope he's right and I'm wrong, is to enter old parties and transform them from within. And we've seen that with Jeremy Corbyn in the British Labour Party. We're seeing it to a certain extent, at least in ambition, from Bernie Sanders, and in a number of other countries, this hope. My fear is that this is going to dissipate the energies and lead to a hiatus inside Labour parties and Social Democratic parties, and a lot of waste of energy fighting internal battles. But I think it's a respectable course to be taking, and I support it in the sense that we hope it's right. We hope that it leads somewhere. And there is one reason why there is a stronger chance of it succeeding than, say, a year ago, and that is precisely because of the emergence of Trump and these wild creatures over here. Because more people who don't have an affinity with the Precariat or the Precariat debate are saying, oh, look, we better move in that direction because the alternative is just too frightening. Okay? So there is more reason for thinking there is some reason, some hope there. And we should try it. We should try it. The alternative is, of course, to set up new political movements. Say, look, these old fuddy-duddies over here are not going to succeed. And we have seen that in some European countries, most conspicuously in Spain. And Podemos, which is a Precariat party of young people, came up from nowhere to win seats in the European Parliament last year and played very cleverly, categorizing the old mainstream conservative and socialist parties as la casta, putting them both as corrupt and deadwood. Dead men walking was Beppe Grillo's famous expression in Italy when his movement suddenly came up and got 25% of the vote. Podemos now has got to the point where it has 79 MPs in the Spanish Parliament and is holding the balance of power. So that is having some success. And there are other countries like Portugal, and there's a new Precariat movement in Poland and Sweden and a number of others. I think that too must be welcomed, because some sort of political realignment must take place. And I want to end by saying that the Precariat Charter, there are a few copies of the book, there, is like a charter of demands against the state, drawn up from the perspective of the precariat. It's a package. And it comes from talking and listening to those groups that around the world that I've been fortunate to interact with. And Article 25 is about basic income. I've been lobbying and working for a basic income for nearly 30 years. And when we set up bien, and everybody is welcome to join, and I hope you will, we wanted a broad church. And I was working in the United Nations, and I remember the head of the Social Security Department demanding my head, saying I was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Last week I come to this country and we start talking about basic income. I was on Q&A and I was on radio and the Future of Work conference, and your esteemed Prime Minister dismisses the idea as barking mad. So I'm glad to know I'm still mad. But as I said at the Future of Work conference, there are a lot of us barking now. And our woof is getting very loud. And we're drawing the support of a surprisingly large number of very prominent people on the left and the right from around the world who are contradicting themselves, as I remind some of them. 5 or 10 years earlier, they were dismissing basic income as an idiotic idea. And now they're acting as if they've just invented it. And I was invited to speak about basic income in the Brazilian Senate. And I'd been speaking about it a few years ago, and everybody was totally uninterested and disdainful. And there I was standing later with a whole series of ministers coming up to the podium, all basically saying, we must move towards a basic income. And at the end of the conference, I said, well, blessed is the child who has many foster parents, because he or she will receive some wonderful Christmas presents. John Key was fundamentally disgraceful in dismissing this idea. We can have a basic income in New Zealand as any other country. We've done pilots in India. Okay, this book is the result of those pilots, where we took thousands of people in communities and provided them with a basic income for 18 months. Every month, every man, every woman, and every child received a monthly cash amount unconditional. And we monitored the effects over those 18 months and compared it, what happened, with similar villages where nobody was receiving the basic income. Yesterday we had a very good discussion with Gareth and Gareth Morgan, I beg your pardon. Gareth, apologies. Great man, I think, delightful man, and his staff. And they made a video this morning. And I was saying, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a pilot in New Zealand? Right? It will come if enough of us put enough pressure on the Labour leadership, on the Greens, all the other groups that could play a part. It's up to us, really, to put that pressure. There's a new network established, Basic Income New Zealand. I hope all of you will join it. You don't necessarily have to agree with every type of approach. It's about moving in the direction of a basic income. And I believe that we will win the debate if we stress something above all other things. A basic income is a matter of social justice. It's not a tool for eradicating poverty. It is that, but there are other tools, right? It's not something that is a panacea. But the income and wealth of every single one of us is far more due to the efforts of our ancestors and our predecessors than anything you or I do ourselves. But we don't know whose ancestors made those vital contributions that produced this wonderful country. We don't know that. So in a sense, you could say that every single New Zealander resident in New Zealand should have a dividend that's from the wealth and the efforts of those previous generations. That sense of social justice is important because that is what unites communities and people, and it is fundamental to a progressive politics. It's what differentiates us from the right. We believe in empathy and solidarity. If we go in that direction, I think we will win because people can see the justice. And you can turn around and say, wait a minute, if you condemn a basic income as giving something for nothing, what about inheritance of wealth? The people who are inheriting vast estates and yachts and blah, 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 and in this country not paying anything in inheritance tax. They've done nothing for that except birth by chance. So stop saying you're against something for nothing. You give a lot of something for nothing to yourselves. And we want something for a whole community. But another argument that you're going to have to resolve, and I deal with all of the claims made against a basic income in the Precariat Charter. I list them and I go through them, and then the advantages. I won't go into them now. But the one that I want to end with is this. And we discussed this with Gareth and his people yesterday and again this morning, and when we made a video in his offices. People say if you give people a basic income, they will all be lazy. They'll go and sit on the beach and drink beer all the time. They tried that argument in India against us, all the bureaucrats, before they gave us the right to do the experiment. And some of the women who'd come from the villages attended one of the meetings, and I was really worried that the bureaucrats were going to win just by sheer force of being bureaucrats. But there was one woman from a village, and she leant forward when she'd heard them saying, you can't do it, blah, 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 all the standard things. And she leant forward and she said, sorry, but do you think you know more about what's good for my child than I do? You think I'm going to waste it when I have my children to bring up? And of course they all shrunk in their seats. What we found in the experiments and what have been found in pilots elsewhere and psychological experiments is that people who have basic security work more, not less. They're more energized, they're more confident. Their health and the degree of stress are improved. And not only do they work more, but they're more productive when they work. They're more cooperative with others because they feel more secure. They feel that they are part of a community. And the psychological and other experiments in our day to show people who have basic security are more tolerant of other people, more altruistic, and therefore less likely to go to some political extremism. We can all understand that, can't we? Now, if we can understand it, it's our job to convince others to do the same. Believe in your fellow human beings. Trust in them. And that is the big argument that we've got to do. We've got to take it forward. We've got to show how it works. We've got to argue with persuasion. We've got to build up the evidence. We've got to disseminate the evidence. That is the challenge in front of us. And I hope BINS will play its role. And I hope you will do so too. Because it's a great journey. Thanks very much.
you very much, Guy. Don't sit down. I think you're going to do much more talking. So, anyone like to ask any questions or make any comments? Yes, I can see. Yes, down there.
Could you tell us about any trials for basic income in more developed countries?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I just felt I should curtail my talk. The next country I'm going to from here actually is Finland. And the Prime Minister of Finland, much to everybody's surprise, but he's come out in favour of a basic income, and he wants to launch a pilot later this year. And they've asked me to go to Finland, to Helsinki, play an advisory role, because they're thinking of different variants of a pilot. And one of the problems is the Prime Minister and the Minister of Welfare have different views, and one of their concerns is the pilot would lead to an influx of migrants, because the design of a pilot can avoid that problem without any problems. I mean, you have to make a pragmatic decision, which is that only legal residents qualify for the basic income, and anybody who is a migrant would have to register, become a legal migrant, and then over time become eligible. It's a pragmatic rule. You've got to have a pragmatic rule. It's not something that is an ideal. So I think the Finnish experiment is going to be extremely interesting. 19 cities of the Netherlands have announced that they're going to launch pilot basic income schemes. I was in Maastricht and Amsterdam recently, where many of the councillors from the local authorities were talking. We had a big meeting like this about the designs. It's very good. We made an hour-long program, TV program in the Netherlands. It was a very strange experience for me, because I was done up with microphones, followed for 3 days, and they made this hour-long program. It's taken off in the Netherlands. It helped legitimize the debate in the Netherlands. Recently, rather more controversially, a TV channel, mainstream TV channel in Britain, came to me and said, we want to make a program about basic income, and what we've done is mobilize money to give some families a basic income rather than their benefits that they're receiving now. Okay, rather than their means-tested conditional benefits. And I said, well, okay, because they wanted me to play a role in the filming, and they made a series. And I said to them before they started, I said, this is not really a basic income scheme, because you're selecting families, even if you select them randomly. A basic income is when everybody in a community receives a basic income, which is one of the reasons why I'm against any scheme which says, okay, we'll just give it for children, or we'll just give it for the aged, or we'll just give it for this group or that group. The dynamics are different. If everybody in a community, like we did in Namibia or India or in Manitoba, is receiving a basic income, then there's moral suasion and there's cooperation, and the dynamics and the multiplier effects in the local economy are all significant. We did the program, and surprisingly, all the families who'd received the basic income were followed months while they received it. And I was warning, I said, there's a weakness of will problem here. I said this on screen and before they launched it. I said, I much prefer that you give a modest basic income month after month after month, right? People learn how to handle. They wanted to give, because their funder give them a lump sum. So it's a capital grant. I said, well, there you have the weakness of will problem. Drink a couple of beers, I'll take a risk, a gamble. So I said, you've got to advise them at the beginning of this problem, otherwise your experiment could backfire. Surprisingly, none of the families did that. None of them blew it. They all showed that they wanted to improve their lives. But that, I think, was a bit risky, right? Now, there are other countries that have announced or have let me and others know that they want to do a basic income, including a number of provinces in Canada. Canada has a tradition of supporting a basic income. They really understand it, a lot of Canadians. And there is a billionaire, as I was telling Gareth yesterday, there's a billionaire in Silicon Valley. I was invited to Silicon Valley and gave some talks there, who's come forward behind the scenes. I won't give his name, but his name is quite well known, very well known, who is worried to the point of thinking the pitchforks are coming if this inequality and insecurity continues. And he's prepared to put a lot of money into a pilot in the United States. He's put some announcements out and looking for a 5-year program to do a pilot. I'm not for hire, but I think the interesting thing is you're getting people like him, hardly a lefty radical, thinking that something like this makes sense with the technological revolution, the social revolution, etc., etc. So you're seeing a number of things coming out of the woodwork all at the same time, right? And it would be wonderful if in New Zealand we could come out of the new woodwork. And we've just been talking with the mayor, and she's interested, and a lot of people in New Zealand, including Grant Robertson, who is committed, I think, really genuinely committed to moving towards a basic income. When I first came to New Zealand, I thought, this is bad territory for this subject. It was 4 years ago. But now I'm really excited because the left is waking up. Andrew Little is really very positive. And I think for the first time your left is interested. The Greens are interested. Other groups are showing interest. And I think it's our collective responsibility to hold them to the wheel. Hold them to, don't lose your nerve. No spaghetti backbone. Now, go for it. And you could strike very successfully. So there are developed countries moving in the right direction.
Okay, that one, yeah, you first, then you.
Could you tell us please more about, in terms of your pilot programs, obviously they had a start time and end time.
Sorry?
In your pilot programs,
Yeah.
presumably there was a start and end date. Was there any assessment or an overview of what happened in those groups or those communities after the programs ended? I'm particularly interested in the other end.
Well, very interesting, and I get asked that question quite a lot, as you can imagine. Because after all, if you do a pilot, there has to be an end, all right? And you have to be open with people. We had what's called an awareness day before we launched it. We went into all the villages and we collected everybody and said, this is what's going to happen for 18 months. And at the end of the 18 months, we did a survey after 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, right? And we evaluated the effects on nutrition, on schooling, on health, on economic activity, on equity, attitudes. So we collected a vast amount of data. But we decided to do what we called a post-final evaluation survey, 6 months after the end. And I don't think I know of any other social policy experiment that has done that. All right? So we asked a whole lot of questions 6 months afterwards. And it was remarkable that in most respects, there had been no recidivism, no falling back. They'd broken out of thresholds. Women had become more liberated, and they weren't pushed backwards. Once the breakthrough had come, then the breakthrough was there. And the thing that I often cite, and it's in the book, is that the emancipatory value of a basic income is greater than the money value. Now, that's actually hard for people who haven't thought about it to appreciate. But the emancipatory value meant that people had a sense of control. They could take decisions and make decisions that had lasting effects. And I'll give you one little story, if I may. When we started in one particular village, all the women had veils. They all went around with veils. We had a real problem because we needed their photographs in order to produce the cards so that they could get the basic income before we set up the bank accounts for them. So we had to arrange that they all had their photographs taken in a hut, which is time-consuming. Anyhow, about 7 months later, I went back to that particular village with some of my Indian colleagues. We were working together. And I said to one of them, I said, "Have you noticed a change here?" No. I said, "Have you noticed? None of the women are wearing veils." They said, "Yeah, yes. I hadn't thought of that, yeah." So we called some of the women across, and they wouldn't tell us. And we, "Please, why are you no longer wearing veils?" And then one of them said, "Wait, before we had to do what the elders told us to do. Now we have our own money." Gotcha. Gotcha.
There's one down back. Yes, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for your talk. Just wondering, can you talk to one of our radio stations as well, or do you become a host, I was in America a few years ago, at the time that Mr. Obama gave his inaugural address. And I've just got a quote from it I'd like to share with you. Just one paragraph here says, "In reaffirming the greatness of our nation, we understand that greatness is never a given. It must be earned. Our journey has never been one of shortcuts or settling for less. It has not been the path for the faint-hearted, for those that prefer leisure over work, or seek only the pleasures of riches and fame. Rather, it has been the risk-takers, the doers, the makers of things, some celebrated, but more often men and women obscure in their labour, who have carried us up the long rough path toward prosperity and freedom." Now, your talk has touched on the concept of leisure, and you go back to the days of the Greeks and the original meaning.
What's the question, mate?
Oh, no, just let him finish.
He's getting there, I think. I can see where it's coming, I think. Go on.
How do we transform the definition of leisure beyond the commercial free time
Correct.
notion
Yeah.
to respect the original meaning?
No.
Which is about that commons and the civic engagement.
I don't know if you've read my book, but you've captured a theme that's in the books. I think every age has its stupidity about what is work and what is not work. And I argue in the books that our age is the most stupid of all. So all work that is not labour disappeared from statistics, it disappeared from rhetoric, it disappeared from economics. So the work that women do in particular, care work, voluntary work, doesn't count, has no value. So we went trundling through the 20th century, linking entitlements to labour, not work. So that if I hire a woman as a housekeeper, national income goes up, employment goes up, growth goes up, unemployment goes down. If I then marry her and she continues to do precisely the same work, national income goes down, employment goes down, economic growth goes down. It's stupid. It's sexist and stupid. And every feminist, and I hope we're all that, should be saying to the politicians and people who talk about work when all they're talking about is labour, that they're stupid. Because that's the only way we're going to make advances. And one of the great advantages of a basic income is you say to people, you can choose what forms of work and labour and leisure you can do. It gives you a greater sense. It doesn't give you total sense. We're not talking about huge amounts. We're talking about an anchor. But it gives you a tilt to saying you can spend more time doing other forms of work that are not labour, but which are socially more valuable. But also we need a strategy, a politics of time on the left that's different from the old social democratic agenda, because we need to revive real leisure. The leisure he's just alluded to, that the ancient Greeks regarded as the most important activity of a citizen. Public participation in the life of the polis, in the life of society. That's what leisure is about, not consumption and watching cricket matches with Mike Smith and being humiliated. In my case. But leisure in the sense, he enjoyed it. But leisure in the sense that we are social animals helping to be subversive, critical people. And we need to strengthen that, because the commercialization and commodification of education is making it harder for people to do that. The Donald Trumps of the world are a triumph for diseducation, playing on the ignorance about civics and culture and philosophy and history, playing on that, which has been deliberately fostered by commercialization of education. Real leisure includes political participation. And I actually, on Article 28 of the Charter, I said the only condition that I would contemplate having is that when you start receiving your basic income, you make a moral commitment in a statement of some sort to vote in every general election. You're being treated as a citizen, so you should behave as a citizen. But don't make it a legally binding one, because you may not see out in the political spectrum something that responds to what you need or what you aspire to support. But make it a moral commitment that you will vote. Because one of the reasons the left is losing is that fewer and fewer people, and particularly the young, are voting. Right? We all know that. But in addition, I think that we could make an obligation, again a moral one, not a legal one, that people participate in one political meeting a year in their community, where representatives of the main political parties could answer questions for 3 or 4 hours. We need to strengthen political engagement, deliberative democracy. It's one of our challenges. So leisure is something that is fundamental to this debate.
Right. We've got a couple more questions. And any other? I was just thinking, besides keeping the questions short, you
The
might
answers.
need-
Yes, I think.
There's a man of great energy and passion, as you can see, and written several books. I don't want to go through all of them. You can read them. I can read them. Yes, yours and yours. And
I'll be
yours,
very brief.
and then we'll stop. Okay.
You've presumably got the ear of Gareth Morgan and the Labour Party, who are in the doldrums a little, and they might see this as attractive. Have they got their pencils out and worked out the data? And the obvious thing is, where's the money going to come from? I think we can say where it's going to come from. There'll be some efficiencies to be gained because we get rid of some of the bureaucrats who are involved in allocating money at the moment. What percentage is that? What's going to happen to the taxes? Do they go up, down, sideways, vary a little? And the bottom line is, how much will it work out as in today's figures for each person?
Well, I think that's such a complicated question. I will offend Mike if I try to answer it. I do try to answer it in the books, I promise you. I genuinely believe that they have got their pencils out. You will be seeing some things coming from Gareth and his stable in the next few weeks on the tax issues. I believe a sovereign wealth fund is something that every country should build up, like they've done in Alaska, which now provides a basic income, like they've done in Norway, like many other countries are building up. If you had a New Zealand wealth fund, where you took a levy from all the rentier sectors, the high-tech, the resource-using sectors, all of these, and you put it into and built a fund, you would very quickly have a fund that would reduce inequality and be able to do what these other funds are doing. So you don't have to raise taxes. But I think you will find that there is a lot of tax scope that, as these corporations are not paying tax, right? Now you have taxes, but why aren't they paying taxes? Well, there are some pretty devious things going on. Okay, so the scope for reducing subsidies, etc. The scope, it's not unaffordable. But I think, as Mike said, perhaps read.
Yes, yours.
Yes, the appeal is obvious to the left wing, but on the right, didn't Milton Friedman talk about a negative income tax a very long time ago, and how is that related?
Well, Milton Friedman, and he's absolutely right, is a classic neoliberal monetarist, as you all know. He joined our association towards the end of his life, and his negative income tax, he said to us, he wrote a long message, I remember, he says, it's moving in the same sort of direction, and you might as well have a basic income, it's simpler. That was his conclusion. A negative income tax has the problem that it's only paid after the event. So it's paid at the end of the tax year, and therefore it doesn't give people that sense of security. Well, you know what you got. But it's also family-based, and it was linked to earnings. So it has problems there as well. But at least he knew the reason for having a basic income from the right, which is to that a market system to work properly, people have to be able to make rational decisions. And they can't be expected to do so if they're insecure. Fair enough.
Okay, yes, down your question, sir.
Thank you. It's hard to ask a question.
Okay, all right.
Your talk is so voluminous, covers so many things. The question basically is, are you proposing, when you're starting your pilot studies in Finland, are you proposing to approach the Minister of Education in that country and the various other political sources for the changes that you're really trying to produce? What you're doing, as I understand it, is you're trying to confront the Trump converts in your society, doing it by the back door, or the front door, by changing the people, that part of the population's goals. People have learned that to do those sorts of things from two basic sources, their families and their schooling. And our schooling is aimed entirely, almost, apart from its sport, at the provision of potential jobs when you leave school. And our Minister of Education, nice person though she very well may be, is still focusing on testing for that purpose and focusing everybody into that. You can run as many pilot schemes as you like. At the long term, after you've done your samples, you've got to take a longitudinal study somewhere and try to put it into operation. In which case you've got to address those kinds of conditions. The human condition is one of learning, which is what you're focusing on.
Well, I mean, the short answer to your thing is that a basic income is not a panacea. It doesn't solve every problem. I think those of us on the left have to realize that one of the biggest problems, which is what you've touched on, is the commercialization and commodification of education. It's a real crisis. But we've got to deal with that separately. You can't put everything. One of the articles in my charter is about that subject. I think people have to learn how to handle money and how to use time, especially those people who've been under stress and for a long time. But education is very important, and I agree with you.
There was a gentleman now, that's right, the gentleman's just one more. This will be the last one, okay? Go for it.
I'm in the possession of a basic income, and I suspect that many of us are in that superannuation. And although I do quite a bit of voluntary work, I do not contribute, I'm afraid, to the GDP. What message do you have for me?
I think you have a very interesting political challenge on this issue. And superannuation is among the most privileging systems for basic income for the elderly in any country I know. And if we're honest, it's probably overgenerous for a particular group relative to everybody else. That's the issue. We were asked, Philippe, you mentioned my friend Philippe van Parijs and myself were giving a talk to leftist parties in Belgium, his country, and they were asking about taxes. And Philippe and I both looked at each other and we stood up together and we said, if we're honest, we're paying too low a rate of taxes for a good society. And we should confront that issue morally. Okay? It's the same with Super Ann. Of course, it's vital that elderly people have security and a decent income and a decent standard of living. But you have to have your system structured in a way where all groups have roughly the same basic security. And I think that over time, some adjustments have to be made. I'm not proposing that you should be impoverished in any way at all, so don't get that message. I just think the structures have to be addressed.
Right, okay, well, once again, thank you very much, Guy. This is the second, as Guy said, he's been to New Zealand four times now. It looks like it's becoming an annual habit, and we certainly want to continue that, particularly since you can come and enjoy some good fishing and of course some good cricket every night.
And some good wine after talks.
Some good wine afterwards. So, I do think what I do see actually in the times have been, I agree with Guy, the issues and the subjects that he's raising are, I think, an idea whose time is coming, and we're talking about pilots. Maybe it's, and the difference in as he says, the water is significant. So I think again, it is up to us. Buy the books, talk to others, join Basic Income New Zealand, support the Fabian Society. As I said, we will hope to come regularly to Christchurch during the course of the year. We have a little koha basket by the door because our meetings you see are all free. We subsist on people's generosity. So please, if you are able to make a contribution. And as I said, I look forward to seeing you, or seeing many of you here again in Christchurch with the assistance of the WEA. So, okay, thanks very much once again. Thank you.
Deep sea fishing. And trout. And fly fishing for trout. Yeah, okay. I'll let him know.